These off so you guys can see well. All right, so today we are going to be talking about photosynthesis and respiration. You did talk about both of these back in 7th grade. If you remember those things, you learned about like the formula, the equation for photosynthesis and respiration. You probably had to memorize it. So a lot of this will be repeat, sort of review from that. These two pictures, this is a really cool animal. This is a slug. But this slug actually eats plants, and then it incorporates the chloroplast into its body. That's why it's green. And it can then go through the process of photosynthesis because it has those chloroplasts. So it's actually an animal that can go through photosynthesis because it consumed plants. It's pretty neat. It's very rare. It's only the only organism I know that can do that.
What does this look like?
You might not have this slide. It looks like this. All right. It should be in the cells packet. Or it might be in the cell. Is it cells or cell processes?
The first thing just says cellular.
Oh, yeah. All right. So let's talk about photosynthesis. I know you guys know what it is. So if I ask you in your own words, what is photosynthesis? What would you say? Jenna?
Converting sunlight to food for plants.
Okay. Yeah. So converting sunlight and some other things into food. That's what photosynthesis. We sometimes say organisms can make their own food. And, when we say food, what we're really talking about is they make a sugar called glucose. Okay. So photosynthesis is extremely important, obviously. Provides the base of all food webs and all ecosystems. They're all based on photosynthesis, right? If you don't have plants, you can't have the rest of the ecosystem. Everything relies on those plants being able to absorb the sun's energy and then use it to capture that energy as in form of glucose. It also releases oxygen. The process of photosynthesis, one of the end products that's released is oxygen. So it helps provide the oxygen to our atmosphere, helps absorb some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is really important. And so what we say about photosynthesis, it takes energy from light and kind of stores that energy in the bonds of the molecule, in the molecule glucose. Now, when we have a chemical compound like glucose or starch or protein, it actually can store energy. The bonds take energy to form and break, and so organisms can actually use that energy to do things that are useful. So we say it's chemical bond energy is where that energy is. And photosynthesis is called a photochemical reaction. It needs light in order to work. Plants in the dark can't go through the process of photosynthesis. So, as you know, most plants are green, or the parts that go through photosynthesis are green. And that's because they have a special molecule called chlorophyll that can absorb the light energy. It's called a pigment. A pigment is a molecule that can capture light energy. But actually, chlorophyll is only one of the types of pigments that you see in plants. Chlorophyll can absorb certain wavelengths of light. Because white light from the sun, is actually made of all of the different wavelengths of light combined. And so different pigments can absorb different parts of that spectrum. So chlorophyll is the dominant one. That's why most of the time when you look at around here, you look at the leaves of trees, they're green. That's because chlorophyll is the dominant pigment. However, if you look across the parking lot over there, you're starting to see that as autumn is coming, the chlorophyll in those leaves is starting to break down. The trees are starting to shed their leaves. And so once the chlorophyll, which breaks down first, starts to break down, you start to see some of the other pigments that are in there. So you look across the parking lot, you can see reds, you can see orange, you can see yellow. Now those colors are always there. Those pigments are always there in the leaves, but they're covered up by the dominance of chlorophyll. But now that's starting to change. So the other pigments, carotene, you look out there, you see an orange pigment, that's called carotene. It's also what makes carrots and squash orange. There's xanthophyll, which is the yellowish pigment. Okay, you can see in some of those trees there turn yellow. Okay, that makes bananas yellow, peppers yellow. There's also reds. Okay, like those sugar maples that turn red and red maples. That's the same pigment found in tomatoes and so forth. But there's all these various pigments, and the purpose is so they can absorb different parts of the spectrum. So here you can see those pigments, and you can see the chlorophyll. There's different types of chlorophyll. Absorbs most of the light that's in this blue end of the spectrum, blue and over here, and also at the red end. Then the other pigments can absorb other areas. What you'll notice is the pigments don't absorb a lot in this area here. Okay? If you were to try to grow a plant and you only shine green light on it, it wouldn't grow very well because most of that light in that part of the spectrum is not actually absorbed by those pigments. So the organelle where this happens in eukaryotic cells is in the chloroplast. So chloroplasts are the organelles where you find this. And chloroplasts, they look like a little bean, but inside are like stacks of almost poker chips, they look like. And you can see that here, these little discs, Oreo cookies, you might call them. You don't have to know the details about what the parts are, but those little sacs, those little discs are called thylakoids. They're in those stacks called grana. And then surrounding them is this fluid called the stroma. All these different parts of the chloroplast, they actually do different tasks during photosynthesis. So when we look at a leaf, if we were to look into a leaf, the leaf's cross section, we call it. Like this up here, this is the top of the leaf, and down here is the bottom of the leaf. Okay, leaves have different parts to them that sort of do different jobs. Most leaves have like a waxy layer on the top called the cuticle. It helps prevent them from losing too much water, kind of seals them in. And then there's the epidermis on the top and the bottom. That's kind of like the upper and lower surface. But then between those, you have a layer called the mesophyll. And that's what we see, this whole area in between. And it has cells that are arranged sort of vertically, and that's where the most chloroplasts are. That's where most photosynthesis happens, in these cells up here. Also, though, in the mesophyll, you have what's called the spongy layer with lots of pockets of air in there. The purpose of that spongy layer is to allow air to get in to these cells to provide them with the carbon dioxide they need. If we look on the lower end of the leaf, the bottom edge, we have the lower epidermis, but then we have this other structure that's important. These little openings, they're called stoma. They're basically like almost a hole in the leaf. And that allows air to get into the inner surface of the leaf. Because what do the chloroplasts need from the air? For photosynthesis. They need carbon dioxide, correct. And that carbon dioxide is in the air around us. So these openings, okay, that we see on the bottom, the stoma, they allow air, which has carbon dioxide, to get into the leaf so that it can be used by these chloroplasts for photosynthesis. However, when these stoma are open like this, there's a problem sometimes. They also can allow water to escape from the leaf. And so on each side of the stoma, the opening, there's these two special cells that are called guard cells. These guard cells can swell up and close, or they could open, and they help the leaf maintain homeostasis. If it's a really hot, dry day, very sunny day, they might close up because the leaf might dry out in those conditions. If it's a cooler day or less sun or there's plenty of moisture, they might open up, allowing carbon dioxide in, but allowing some water out. So they open and close to help regulate the amount of moisture that can be present inside of the leaves. Those are called the guard cells. And on this slide, we just have sort of a description of what I just told you of each layer in the cell and what they do. So here we can see those guard cells. Here's what they actually look like in the microscope. You can see they look like a pair of lips or something, and they could open and close. Here, the opening in the middle is the stoma, the pore. You can see that this is one guard cell, this is another. And inside those guard cells, there's actually chloroplasts. And that's how they're able to open and close, okay, by relying on the process of osmosis and photosynthesis. So when we look at photosynthesis, one thing you should know is the general equation. The things that go in, the things that are released. Okay. Don't worry much about this table. It gets into some details here. But if we talk about the general overview, photosynthesis, what does it need in order to take place? It requires some things. Feel free to answer at home as well. What does photosynthesis need to work? Light. What else, Francesca? Water. And carbon dioxide. It needs those three things. And if it has them, photosynthesis can take place. And what does photosynthesis produce? Oxygen and glucose. Good. So we can write those things in symbols. Okay? So we have 6 carbon dioxide molecules come in. 6 water molecules come in. And that produces, after photosynthesis, glucose, which is C6H12O6, and oxygen. That's what's produced. It needs chlorophyll, that pigment, in order to happen, and it needs light. Those materials get into the chloroplast. There's a bunch of enzymes that allow the reaction to take place, and it produces eventually glucose. In glucose, then, when we say in photosynthesis, plants make their own food, what they really make is glucose. That's their food. And that's what's going to be used later on to get energy. Now, how quickly photosynthesis takes place can depend on a few different factors. Obviously, light is important. Okay, that if there's a low amount of light intensity is very low, photosynthesis doesn't happen very well. If there's no light, it doesn't happen at all. But as light increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. But eventually, it kind of maxes out. You can't just keep increasing the light intensity and photosynthesis is going to improve more and more. It kind of levels off once it gets to a certain light intensity. Same thing with carbon dioxide. If there's a very small amount of carbon dioxide, photosynthesis won't occur. But as you increase carbon dioxide, photosynthesis increases and eventually then levels off, maxes out. In terms of temperature, At low temperatures, photosynthesis is slow. As temperature increases, it rises. But if temperature gets too high, it starts to drop again. Does this graph shape look familiar? Have we seen this shape in other areas? What were we looking at when we saw the same kind of shape? We did an activity on this. It's the same shape as enzyme activity, right? That is, we heated up an enzyme, it worked better and better, but then if we heated it too much, it slowed down. Or pH. When we change pH, it got to the optimum pH, but if we go above or below it too much, enzyme action decreases. And that's the same case in photosynthesis because it relies on these enzymes. Now, why do these cells need this energy? Well, cells can't stay alive without it. Cells have to have a constant source of energy. They need it to move things around inside of them. They need it for certain types of transport, active transport, which we talked about, to pump molecules in or out. They need it for certain chemical reactions to take place. Now, when we talk about energy in cells, they need a certain molecule. That's their source of energy. That molecule is called ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is what it stands for. And it almost acts like a battery. Okay? That ATP is like a charged up battery. Has energy stored in it. And you could use that energy to charge your phone, charge your computer. Okay? And once that energy gets used up, you could then recharge your battery again. Same thing with ATP. When the energy from an ATP molecule is used, it can be sort of recharged by the cell. Okay? And the way it does that is, so ATP, adenosine, triphosphate, has these three phosphates. These have a lot of energy, the bonds in these molecules. And so when energy is needed by the cell, it can break off one of them, and that energy can be used to do something. And this just shows some of those things. Movement, okay, or pumping molecules, chemical reactions. That's why cells need energy. So the process that actually charges up ATP, that's what cellular respiration is. Okay? It takes one of those molecules and gives the energy back to it so the cell can use it. So cellular respiration is the word when we take a molecule of glucose and transform that energy, capture that energy in the form of ATP. So glucose is used to charge up that ATP molecule. And it happens through a series of steps. It's a chemical reaction, like photosynthesis is a chemical reaction. And the energy from glucose is captured. There's really two main types of respiration, anaerobic and aerobic. You don't have to worry too much about them. One of them uses oxygen and one doesn't. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen, and it can get a lot of energy out of a single glucose. Oxygen is important for that. There also, however, is anaerobic respiration. It doesn't use oxygen, but it can't get all of that energy out. It can only get a much smaller amount of that stored up energy out of the glucose molecule. Okay? So in our bodies, most of the time, aerobic respiration is taking place. We're breathing in oxygen. That oxygen is being delivered to our cells. Our cells are then breaking down glucose to get as much energy as possible. However, if our muscles can't get enough oxygen, they might switch to anaerobic respiration. They can still get a little bit of energy, but not as much. And so as that happens, we can't use our muscles as well anymore. So if you were, for example, running your very fastest, sprinting as long as possible, your cells might use up all the oxygen to give your muscles energy to sprint, but then you've used up all the oxygen. You can't replace it quickly enough. And your cells might switch to anaerobic respiration, but that produces less energy, so you can't continue to sprint indefinitely because of these processes. We do use anaerobic respiration in lots of ways, sometimes to make different types of foods. When we talk about fermentation, that's using anaerobic respiration, like fermented grape juice that's turned into wine. That's using anaerobic respiration. Produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Making beer, making things like soy sauce or kimchi, yogurt, vinegar, certain types of cheese. All of those processes use anaerobic respiration of yeast or bacteria to make those foods. And when you mix yeast in with flour and water, you make a dough. The yeast that are in that dough, they're consuming sugar in the dough, in the flour. They're going through anaerobic respiration, and they're releasing carbon dioxide. And that's why your bread rises, because little air bubbles of carbon dioxide get trapped in it. So respiration that happens in our mitochondria is called aerobic respiration. It requires oxygen. And it produces ATP. That's the purpose of aerobic respiration, produce ATP. It can get 36 ATP molecules out of a single glucose molecule. It happens in the mitochondria of cells. Mitochondria, as you learned in cell organelles, is the organelle that releases energy. It does that because that's where respiration happens. The formula, the chemical equation for respiration, it's almost the complete opposite of photosynthesis. So respiration needs glucose as its fuel. It needs oxygen. And it releases ATP, which is its energy, and water and oxygen. So that process is respiration. That's happening all the time in our bodies, in our mitochondria. We need a constant source of ATP in order to stay alive. And so this process is what gives us that ATP. Any questions?
It needs oxygen, and how come there's such thing as an anaerobic?
Well, because we need a large amount of oxygen to keep our cells alive. Some things like bacteria or yeast, they don't need as much energy, so they can use anaerobic respiration. Okay, but for our bodies to stay alive, we have to have more energy than that, and so we need aerobic respiration. Good question. But our body will switch to anaerobic if it has to, if we force it to. But we can't survive that long using anaerobic respiration. It's not enough energy for us. Okay. Any questions at home? No?